It's almost 2 weeks since floods devastated KZN, claiming hundreds of lives. Our search and recovery efforts continue as rescuers try to reach those trapped by landslides. But was the high rainfall in a very short space of time the only cause? Talking to us from Stellenbosch University is Dr. Charles MacRobert, a senior lecturer of geotechnical engineering. Dr. MacRobert, thank you so much for your time this evening. You wrote a fascinating piece that appeared on the online platform, The Conversation, entitled "How Geology Put South Africa's a South African City at Risk of Landslide." Now, you say there that you, as a geotechnical engineer, you study the effects of water on the stability of sloping ground. And in eThekwini, you've got sloping ground, water and clay, which from your article I deduce was a very important part of this disastrous cocktail that we saw play itself out when all that rain arrived in a very short space of time. Were you at all surprised by the devastating landslide, which of course was just a part of this disaster we saw play out?
No, not at all. I think if we consider Durban, if we paint a picture for our viewers, I'm sure they're all pretty aware of what Durban looks like by now and the devastation that's been wrought there. But there really are two major geological areas that contributed to the landslides. There is the area along the coast, which is characterized by red dune sands of the Berea Formation. Now, these red dune sands are probably what are most have been sort of viewed in a lot of drone footage. The picture on the screen right now is probably from a more inland location, which is underlain by sandstones and shales, depending on where you are. And these particular formations were investigated quite extensively in the early 90s and late 1980s. In September 1987, there were also extreme landslides in the area, and they were subject to investigation then. And basically, they found that if the rainfall exceeds about 20% of mean annual rainfall in a given event, you can expect. At that time, when they reviewed it, they found that there were at least 10 landslides in the eThekwini region when the rainfall reached that sort of levels. And over the 3 days of the flooding there was some records 300, 400 mils over 3 to 4 days. And in a year, you get only about a meter of rain in Durban. So that quite easily exceeded this landslide threshold. So that's really the inland regions, and then on the coast, where these red dune sands of the Berea Formation are, these sands have very little resistance to large floods of water, especially when they are not controlled by proper surface water structures. If drains are blocked or just completely overwhelmed by the rainfall, then they just break loose and basically carry this red sand dune away. And I think a lot of the drone footage we've seen shows us that. So no, it definitely didn't come as a surprise if we look at the geology. I think the amount of rain that fell over that time was definitely a surprise.
Now, you've mentioned there the inland shales. You've also mentioned the Natal group sandstones. Just to try and break it down for the layperson watching right now, let's look, for instance, at the Bluff and the Berea Ridge. Now, you wrote in your piece that the Berea Formation was subject to intense investigation in the late 1950s following those landslides along the Bluff. Now, the 1950s right now would have been a long time ago. From a geological and a climate point of view, what could have changed since the 1950s that would have made the devastation we've seen over the last week so much worse than maybe they would have experienced back then?
I think that the sort of trying to figure out if it's got worse. The geological conditions haven't gotten worse. I think what has happened is that there's just been a lot more development. So if we look at the eThekwini municipality actually maintain a database or a series of maps which sort of highlight zones which are at risk. And a lot of those maps date from those studies in the 50s and 70s. And development has since gone on. Development has taken place in more regions, and a lot of those regions haven't been perhaps mapped as effectively as they could be. So there isn't that information available to residents to know where they should build their structures. And I guess with the rapid urbanization of those areas, as so many people have moved in from rural areas, they have just built their houses where they can, and often those houses have been built on unstable ground. You asked about the barrier formation, the bluff, and the barrier ridge. That we've also witnessed a lot of development towards the north of Durban, and those barrier sands extend all the way up to Mthunzi, and those sands, although they're quite stable under natural phenomena such as rain, they've been battered by extreme storms over geological history. But what we see now is that the development there has meant that we are now concentrating flow. So we now have hard surfaces created from roads. We channelizing water, and we're developing vast areas, opening it up, flattening it, and in doing that, the stormwater just isn't being controlled effectively. And in some cases where there are stormwater drains, considering the amount of water that fell, it's no wonder that some of them got overwhelmed and just broke loose. And in that case, I would say that it isn't predominantly a climate-related factor, but it's probably more of just the nature of human development in those areas that has contributed to the gullies that we've seen forming in the sands of the barrier formation.
And from what we've been told, the lack of service delivery and maintenance in certain places didn't help either. Just one last question before I let you go, Dr. MacRobert. You say in your piece that landslide mitigation is always difficult, and prediction systems are also very costly to implement. And sometimes, if you look at what's happened overseas, there's political resistance to that kind of thing as well. What would you say the local authorities in the KZN region should be doing in terms of mitigation measures that hopefully would be effective, taking into consideration South Africa's very intricate demands for housing and sanitation as well?
Yeah, in my opinion, the local authorities, their primary focus should be in landslide hazard zoning. As geotechnical engineers, and South Africa has a proud heritage of geotechnical engineers, many of them who would be more than competent to assist the local municipalities in zoning the areas. And the procedures required to zone the areas as risky or not risky are fairly well established. And for example, in the Gauteng area, a lot of work has been done to identify areas that are at risk of dolomite sinkholes. And that is probably what needs to be done in eThekwini. They have a GIS database. It needs a lot of work to be updated. And I think that's the first step, is identifying those areas at risk. And then once those areas at risk have been identified, we can then start to think about early warning systems. Early warning systems, Japan is probably at the forefront of such systems. And even there, those systems don't always work on time. So early warning systems are very difficult, but zoning is definitely something that could be done and is a practical way forward for the local municipalities.
Sounds like a practical plan and science-led as well. Thank you so much for your time and your insight this evening. That's Dr. Charles MacRobert from Stellenbosch University, a senior lecturer of geotechnical engineering. His piece there, how geology put a South African city at risk of landslides, appearing on theconversation.com.